Welcome to the Holy Post. In the past, debates over worship styles were usually marked by generational differences, but a new article says that Gen Z is changing this, with worship preferences being divided along gender lines instead. Dyck joins me and Kaitlyn to discuss the evidence, the implications, and the possible solutions for the worship gender divide. Then Kaitlyn interviews Patrick Miller about his new book with co-author Keith Simon, Joyful Outsiders. He says there are 6 different ways we can respond to the loss of Christian cultural power, but all of them should be marked by joy rather than fear or anger. Also this week, listeners react to our criticism of asking Jesus into your heart and pigeons on a plane. A quick reminder that Chapter 1 of my new book, The World Born in You, Letters to a New Generation of American Christians, is now available exclusively for Holy Post Plus subscribers. This is the most personal and relevant book I've ever written, and I'm doing it in a very different way, as letters to my young adult kids that I'm releasing every month on Holy Post Plus. And I'll be doing a live stream with subscribers as well. So, if you want to join me on this journey, you can go to holypost.com to read the introduction and then sign up for Holy Post Plus using the code BOOK for a 20% discount. Again, go to holypost.com and use the code BOOK for a 20% discount on Holy Post Plus. Here is episode 672. Hello and welcome to the Holy Post. I was about to say welcome to SkyPod, but it's Holy Post Day. I am Skye Chitani. I am here starting off the show because our fearless leader, Phil Vischer, could not join us today. But filling in for Phil is our good friend, Dyck. Hi, Drew.
Hi, that's a little scary. I don't know if I can fill those shoes.
Oh, no pun intended. No one's asking you to fill the shoes.
No, and I can't sing. I won't sing.
Oh, that's a requirement, actually, to fill in for Phil, is some singing.
You have to do VeggieTale voices, Drew. And that's Kaitlyn Chess. Hi, Kaitlyn.
Hi, Skye.
You're back in North Carolina. You're not in studio with us. You're not in Wheaton.
Temporarily in North Carolina. But we're only going to have like a handful of episodes before I'm in the studio all the time. Yeah, so that's exciting.
Drew, I don't know if you heard last week, but the news was announced that Kaitlyn is moving to Wheaton.
Big news.
Big news.
Big news. Big news.
Which makes
that
me...
just confirms your Christian credentials living in...
I'm incredibly Christian. Yeah, that it just pulls you eventually. Mm-hmm,
yep.
mm-hmm.
Which makes me wonder, Drew, when are you moving back?
Well, yeah, I moved away from
what
Wheaton,
does it mean that you moved away? Yeah.
It's not good. Hope that doesn't come up in my life review when I die. Yeah.
I'm sure the statute of limitations is run out by now. You could come back.
That's true. It's never too late. Never too late.
All right, with that, here's the theme song.
What's the news that you like the most? Who's your favorite podcast host? If it's breakfast, get your toast. It's Skye and Phil and the Holy Post. Skye and Phil and the Holy Post.
And sometimes Kaitlyn.
The Holy Post is sponsored by BetterHelp. We are living in crazy times, and that can be hard on your mental health. Plus, relationship stress, parenting, marriage, and work stress, it all adds up. Well, don't try to handle all this on your own. You can get help from trained professionals. But the economy and tariffs and the price of eggs, adding therapy onto all that feels like a huge investment, and the cost of traditional in-person therapy can be huge, costing anywhere from $100 to $250 per session. Online therapy with BetterHelp can save you, on average, up to 50% for each session. BetterHelp is the world's largest online therapy platform, having served more than 5 million people around the world. It's easy, too. You can join a session with the click of a button to help fit therapy into your busy life. And you can switch therapists at any time. You can do better than just survive these crazy times. Your well-being is worth it. Visit BetterHelp.com/HolyPost today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/HolyPost. This episode is sponsored by Blueland. When our kids were little, keeping the house clean became really important. Why? Because they licked stuff. They put everything in their mouths. The candy is on the floor. Wait, now it's back in their mouth. Lisa didn't just want our house clean. She wanted it mom clean. Clean enough for kids whose little fingers were everywhere. And then back in their mouths. That's why we recommend switching to Blueland. Their products are made to meet the highest environmental standards. They aren't just clean, they're mom clean. Blueland products are 100% plastic-free and made with certified clean ingredients that are safe to use around the little ones we care about so much. You don't have to choose between the safe option and what actually gets your house clean. Try their dishwasher tablets, laundry tablets, or toilet tablets. Proven effective and completely plastic-free. And Blueland has a special offer for Holy Post listeners. Right now, get 15% off your first order by going to blueland.com/holypost. You won't want to miss this. Blueland.com/holypost for 15% off. That's blueland.com/holypost to get 15% off.
Okay, welcome back. We're going to get started in true Holy Post fashion with some animal news.
I was worried for a moment, but we're good. This is good.
Yeah, I can't do the other kind of news without Phil. I think that is trademarked.
Sacrilegious.
Yeah, for his use only. Okay, headline. Delta flight erupts into chaos as pigeons fly around the main cabin.
Wow. That's
so
a new fear to add to your fear of flying.
A couple weeks ago, we had a story about a flight. I think it was a United flight that was trying to take off from Denver that had, I think it sucked a rabbit into its engine. Was that the story?
Oh, yeah.
Right? It sucked a rabbit into the engine and they couldn't take off. This is a Delta flight that was trying to take off Saturday. I think it was 2 Saturdays ago when pandemonium broke out in the main cabin. The plane was taking off from Minneapolis, St. Paul and was traveling to somewhere. Probably irrelevant. But according to an Instagram post by Tim Caw, I think it's funny his name is Caw.
That is kind of funny.
I mean, what are the chances? That's the sound that a bird makes. Caw said the pilot announced that a pigeon sighting there was a pigeon sighting, but that sounds weird because you could see a pigeon outside the plane, right? There was a pigeon sighting inside the cabin, and he had the bird removed before takeoff. But as the flight was taxiing for takeoff, a second pigeon emerged. Where are these birds hiding that they didn't see them?
Many?
Right. Here's my theory. I think there was a magician on the flight, and he was hiding. He was hiding pigeons in his carry-on for his performance,
delighting the children throughout this debacle.
And so pigeons just kept coming out of his hat. So a second pigeon emerged and flew down the main aisle of the cabin. There's a video of this. Did you see the video?
Oh my gosh.
It's fantastic.
I'm looking at it now.
Yeah, it's great. The pilot radioed the control tower and said that they were coming back due to a pigeon, which is weird. Okay, so
there was just one.
No, there was still, because they had a pigeon in the plane before it left the gate.
Right, but the only one that they had once they were in flight was one.
But what are the chances of two?
That's
getting into the plane.
They were a couple.
Yeah, there's a little family in there.
They're not like penguins. They don't pair up for life. They're not monogamous.
Well, it's not for life. It's for one flight, Skye.
All right. I just think it's weird that there's two birds. All right. This is a question I have. You guys fly a lot. I fly a lot.
Yeah.
Pick your choice. Either what is the strangest animal that you've encountered on a plane? Because people are bringing all kinds of animals on planes now. Or just generally, what's the weirdest thing you've experienced on a flight? And is it animal related? This is not a trick question, guys.
I think, although I will say about the pigeons on the plane, I would rather have birds inside the plane than outside the plane.
Yes.
You
yes.
know?
Good point.
There's lots of birds outside the plane.
Well, yeah, I know. But I mean, going through the engine and taking down the plane.
Flight hazard.
Well, of course. Yeah, flight hazard. A pigeon probably wouldn't take down a plane, but
no.
Yeah, but then second, I'd be a little nervous, that they were doing target practice in there. I might throw my cap on. Yeah, but I don't know. I can't think of any weird animals I've seen on a flight. I've seen some weird people.
Yeah,
that's what I was gonna say.
Okay, then weirdest people or incidents or disruptions that you have experienced on a plane. Have you seriously not experienced any major disruptions on a plane?
The weirdest thing that happened to me quite recently was I was sitting in a window seat and there was a woman who came and sat in the middle seat pretty early in the flight. And then as we were about to take off, I noticed that the aisle seat was empty. So I was kind of confused. I was like, why would you not move over to the aisle seat? I learned a few minutes into the plane that it's because she intended to fully lay down across all 3 seats and really had no concern for the fact that I was in one of them. So she just put her feet up on the aisle seat, put a Snuggie on. And this was a flight from O'Hare to RDU. So it was a 2-hour flight and just laid her whole top half of her body against me to go to sleep.
She basically put her head on your lap.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And did you do anything? Did you say, excuse me?
It's a character flaw of mine. I just was like, I just let it happen.
Would you have let that happen if it was a man?
Probably more so, yeah.
Oh, Kaitlyn, boundaries, boundaries.
I know. I just would be so scared to like offend them.
Yeah, that's pretty tough. I mean, if there's an empty seat and someone's sitting next to you, that's sociopathic
What are they
behavior.
doing? Thank you, Drew. Thank you.
What's going
Even
on
apart
there?
from the later part, I was like, what? Why would you not move?
I definitely would have gone there. I'd have been like, hey, this is cool. We got an extra seat. Why don't we spread out a little bit?
Yeah.
Give me a little extra room.
So I had an incident. This isn't the craziest thing that's happened to me on a plane, but it's animal related. Amanda and I were flying back. I think we were in California somewhere. We were flying back on a Southwest flight, and there was a stop. And we didn't have to change planes, but a lot of people deplaned, and we were sitting way in the back. So we decided, let's move all the way to the front row where there's more leg room.
Mm-hmm.
So we did that. And I've flown Southwest a lot. And I asked the flight attendant, hey, like, how full is this next flight? And she's like, oh, it's not full at all. I'm like, great. So Amanda and I spread out. I took the aisle. I think she took the window, and we had an empty seat in between us. And we thought this way. So people start boarding the plane, and everyone's doing their thing, and no one wants middle seats. So they're bypassing us. And we're like, great, we'll have more space to spread out on the last couple hours home. And then the very last person to get on the plane was a young woman with a very large dog, like big dog, at least probably a black lab or something of that size.
Oh my gosh.
And
Whoa.
and the dog had one of those service animal vests on, the red vest. And of course she sits right in between me and Amanda. And then the dog is so big, he takes up the entire foot space for all three seats. So we both have to put our feet up on the bulkhead in front of us.
No.
And the dog's butt is by Amanda's seat, and his head is by my legs. And he was a very nice dog. He was super sweet. I love dogs. So I enjoyed like having this dog's face in my lap much of the flight, and he was friendly and I love petting him. But Amanda got the less friendly end. And she just looked at me like, are you kidding me? We moved up here, we got this, and we get less room than anyways. But I don't understand how that dog would have fit anywhere else on that plane. Like if that seat had not been open.
That's crazy.
It's a weird I don't get this whole animal Have any of you traveled with an animal for any reason?
No, I don't want to.
Right.
Yeah, we did, but like we had a kitten, and he was like in a little bag. It was very cute, although he kept trying to get out, which made me nervous.
Still cute.
So it was cute. Yeah.
Well, if any holy posters out there have good animal on a plane stories, not snakes on a plane.
No, thank you.
Samuel
I don't
Jackson
want to
did
hear
that.
any of that.
But other animals on a plane story, I'd be interested in hearing. Okay, that's been our animal news for today. We want to go back to something we talked about last week, at least you and I, Kaitlyn, because Drew, you weren't here. But Drew, you are welcome to weigh in. So last week we did a mailbag episode where we answered questions from listeners, and one person sent in a question asking, I forget the question in specificity, but something around children's ministry, and do we think it's a good idea to use the language of asking Jesus into your heart? And Kaitlyn, you and I, actually all three of us, me, you, and Phil, we're all on the same page that it's really not a great idea. But you and I both kind of made the argument that it's not biblical either. So that seemed to provoke some of our listeners, and we got some response to that.
Which is good. We should have a conversation about it.
That's what we're going to do. We're going to have a second round of conversation about this. Before I give some of the listener feedback, Drew, do you want to give your argument about asking Jesus into your heart, which you clearly never did? So why not?
Especially since I moved away from Wheaton. Yeah, I like this. I've heard your guys' conversation. Now I can come in with the perfectly nuanced truth on this subject. I hope I didn't set the bar too high. Well, okay, first of all, I should say I accepted Jesus into my heart. I don't know about you, Skye, but when I was, after years of wandering in sin, desperate and broken at the age of 5, I gave my life to Jesus by accepting him into my heart and said some version of the sinner's prayer, I believe.
So you do that in Canada?
It made it all the way to Canada, that trend. And so I did it, and I think it took. So I'm grateful for that. That said, I think I have to agree largely with what you guys were saying, because it's not really explicitly found in Scripture. And actually what struck me too was that it's almost a perfect reversal of one of the Apostle Paul's favorite expressions, in Christo, in Christ, right? He says it like more than 200 times in some variation. And so instead of, it's probably more important to be in Christ than he be in your heart, I would say, given that biblical language. And I think there's a subtle but important shift with that language too, right? Because if you're going to be in Christ, that puts Jesus kind of at the center. He's in charge. He's the center of gravity. Whereas if the emphasis is on accepting him into your heart, then you kind of have the agency. You're the one who gets to decide, okay, yeah, you can come into my heart. So I think for that reason, I prefer the scriptural language rather than what we've adopted of inviting Jesus into your heart. Now, that said, am I going to be the pompous jerk who went to seminary who comes to a VBS volunteer and says, you dirty heretic, stop getting these kids to accept Jesus into your heart? I mean, that's how I came into the family of God. No metaphor is perfect. Yeah, it's not very biblical. I think we should swap it out with something else. But hey, God uses imperfect means. Thank goodness.
Okay, so you're kind of in conformity with what we were saying last week. I mean, this might be an oversimplification, but I kind of recall two different arguments that we were giving, Kaitlyn, and jump in if I'm missing this. One was, it's not very biblical. It's the metaphor doesn't appear clearly in scripture the way it's being used in these children's ministries. But then secondly, and this was more Phil's main point, is kids, especially younger kids, have a lot of difficulty embracing the abstract concepts like asking Jesus into your heart. Whereas something more concrete like following Jesus as your king or teacher, something is easier for them to grasp than something as abstract as asking Jesus in your heart. In response to that, we got a bunch of people throwing at us Bible verses that speak about the heart and Jesus.
Or kindly offering up Bible verses that speak about the heart.
Right. Yeah. So one person said, there are several passages that make it clear that the metaphor of God or Jesus, quote, dwelling in our hearts is not an extra biblical fabrication. This person cites 2 Corinthians 1, 21 and 22, where Paul says that God has given us his spirit in our hearts as a guarantee. In 2 Corinthians 4:6, he says that God has shone in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. And probably we got this one a little bit. Galatians 4:6, Paul says that God has sent the spirit of his son into our hearts. And the passage I think we got a number of times from different listeners was Ephesians 3:17, where Paul says, I pray that out of his glorious riches he may strengthen you with power through his spirit in your inner being, so that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith.
Yeah.
Okay, so have we been checkmated by our own listeners, Kaitlyn?
I think another theme that we talked about that is related to what Drew said and that you sort of mentioned too, Skye, is we were concerned with this not as a metaphor for thinking about our relationship with Christ or the church's relationship with Christ, though Drew's point is so good that it's so much more often that we are in Christ than that Christ is in us, but more so on this emphasis of this like singular moment. And I'm coming in as like the more reformed person too. I'm also concerned with the like agency being ours. like it's just Jesus is powerless at the door, just hoping that we'll let him in. And most of these passages, and most of these passages have more to do with what God has given us apart from any action that we have done, right? Like this is just what has happened to you. Not that there is not some sense of response to God's grace, but my concern with the like inviting Jesus into your heart makes it sound like he needs an invitation and the agency is fully on you. And this was partially Phil's point too, was it puts so much emphasis on this single moment when the verses that were referenced are beautiful verses about Christ or the Spirit dwelling in us and that important like interpersonal spiritual experience, but they're not emphasizing do this. Like in this moment of your conversion, ask Jesus into your heart. It's often either this is already true of you. It should change how you live and act, but this is already true of you. You already have this. Or in the Ephesians example, praying that you are strengthened by that experience of the Spirit of Christ dwelling in you. And so I think part of our concern was not only the children part of like these abstract ideas are hard for them to grasp. And I can give even more examples of like kids who end up with pretty bad theology as adults because no one was pretty clear with them as a child, or they told them a oversimplified version of things that they were like, that's good enough for now. But actually that's the thing that stuck. It was the offhand comment. It was the metaphor. That really stuck with them. So it's partially just like, is this good language for kids? It's partially just many of us grew up in traditions that and I said this on the show, it's a beautiful thing that evangelicalism wanted our faith to be personal and emphasized a moment of conversion. But that also was overemphasized to the point of both giving us a lot of guilt about, did I do it right in that one time? And do I have to do it again to have it be right? But also then diminishing the sense of this is an ongoing journey of sanctification in the community of faith. And that's ironically what a lot of these verses about Christ dwelling in our hearts is, they're addressed to the community and the community experiencing that. And that's a very different emphasis than just make sure he's in your heart, you have the agency, and it's about you individually and personally.
Amen. Okay, I agree entirely. I wonder, though, if and again, Phil brought this up, part of our desire to have this clear moment of conversion that we could count and mark and tally and report back to, the missions board or whatever is really important in a lot of American evangelicalism. It's just interesting to me that we've essentially made up this idea of asking Jesus into your heart as a mark of conversion, because none of the texts that we've read, none of those are marks of conversion. They're all Paul speaking to communities of believers, like you said, about their maturing in the faith and their devotion to Christ, but it's not addressing non-believers. There's no scene of any non-believer being told to ask Jesus into your heart. So we've made this marker up of conversion when there are other marks of conversion that you see in the New Testament that we don't talk about. And the two that come to mind most clearly are repent and be baptized. Like, why don't we use either of those as a mark of conversion?
Yes. Yes.
Wouldn't that be a more... Go ahead.
Yes. Well, it's also, Brad East wrote this great CT piece recently about this, where he was like, I'm speaking as, I believe he's Anglican. I'm coming from that tradition, but I'm saying this to my Baptist brothers and sisters. I'm saying it to Presbyterian. I'm saying it to everyone. Like, we in evangelicalism have de-emphasized baptism. And I don't know if it's in that piece or other places he says this, and this is just my own experience too, of like, the focus on, did you invite Jesus into your heart? It's so personal that there's no ability for anyone else in my community to say, no, I was there for that. Like, they could be there for the prayer, but it's this interpersonal experience. It's like, was it sincere? Did I mean it? Like, that's what racked me with guilt sometimes as a kid. And there's no one that can say, no, like, remember this moment. They can remember the prayer, but they're not really there for the experience. Whereas if we remembered how significant throughout Christian history it was, baptism as this sign, repenting and then being baptized, I love the moment when someone new is baptized into my community and we talk about remembering your own baptism. It's a public thing. It's not a personal thing. And there are people who can say, I stood and said I would pray for you and hold you accountable and aid you in learning scripture. And like that kind of public, verifiable thing. It can be abused in the other direction. There are traditions that sort of said, oh, well, the box was checked. You did it. Like nothing else needs to happen. But if you're coming from a tradition that overemphasized the individual, the personal, the inner, it can be really helpful to go, well, no, in the history of the church, it really mattered to people that like my community saw me be baptized. It was a public profession of faith, but it was also entrance into this community. And that itself is the thing. I can remember that. I can see the picture of that, or I can ask people who were there to tell me about it. I don't have to go, that night in my room, was I sincere enough? Maybe I should do it again.
It's more objective too, which I like, than subjective, right? Because you're right. There's a community, there are witnesses. You are being inducted not only into, an eternal status, but into God's family. And I don't think it's coincidental that the practice of accepting Jesus into your heart aligns pretty neatly with a lot of quintessential American values like individualism and consumerism and personal autonomy, right? Because it's this inward thing. I have control over it. Like Phil, I think, was pointing out last time, he said, it's kind of like making a sale, right? If you're in the seat of the evangelist, you're like, okay, let's close the deal here. I mean, Bill Hybels, I remember him telling stories of sitting down beside someone on an airplane. We're back to the airplane. And he had actually talked to a guy and be like, okay, I want you to sign, like we're just going to get a sheet out. I want you to sign here that you have accepted Jesus. And maybe it was contextualization because this guy's a business dude, but I think that a lot of that has influenced the way we think of salvation.
Totally.
And so that's good to think of. And I do think it's healthier, more biblical to opt for the more communal dimensions that are accompanied with salvation.
Okay, so to put a bow on this whole conversation, we're saying that, of course, there's heart language in the New Testament. Even the language of Jesus dwelling in our hearts is in the New Testament. The difference is, one, none of those texts are conversion stories. They're about maturing in faith. Two, they're not targeting individuals, but Paul's speaking to whole communities. Number 3, we have really clear markers of conversion in the New Testament, repentance and baptism. And 4, all of this is kind of irrelevant because the Jesus dwelling in your heart or accepting Jesus in your heart language for children is so abstract that it doesn't actually communicate what we are intending it to communicate, especially for young kids. So for all those reasons, we're still not fans of the phrase.
But thank you, people, for bringing up verses and wanting to get this right and talk about
Yes.
it and go back to scripture. Like, that is such a gift to us, to everyone listening.
Great. And it allowed us to continue a good, interesting conversation.
Yeah.
Okay, moving on. There's a story in CT. The title is Gen Z Worship War. Did you know that Gen Z was having a worship war? I thought that was only...
Again.
Yeah. This is a Worship War 2, Worship War 3,
At least, man.
right?
Kind of warmed my heart because I was thinking of the worship wars of the 80s and 90s, but yeah.
So
Well,
this...
yeah, if we're going to go really back in history, this is like the 15th,
Wow.
17th, 200th.
If you can't fight about worship, what can you fight about? This is by Luke Simon. So the piece is basically arguing that there is a divide in Gen Z worship that is not just over style, but it's fundamentally a matter of gender. So let me highlight a couple things that he says in the article. Of course, we'll link to it in the show notes for those who want to read it. He says, on the one hand, some of his generation are flocking to more traditional and liturgical forms of Christianity like Eastern Orthodoxy. A 2004 survey from the Orthodox Studies Institute found that Orthodox parishes in the U.S. have a rising number of converts, many of whom are young ex-Protestants. So that's some data. But then he goes on to say, on the other hand, contemporary Christian music, CCM, is thriving. CCM was the 4th fastest growing music genre in the US in the first half of 2024, and market research indicates young audiences are driving much of this growth. So on the one hand, young people appear to be going towards Eastern Orthodoxy, and at the same time, CCM music is thriving because of young music consumers. So he asks, is Gen Z at worship traveling back in time or making its home in modernity? I believe the answer is both at once, and that the primary worship divide in my generation isn't random, nor is it strictly about theology, denomination, or politics. The main difference is sex. Zoomers gravitating toward traditional worship are mostly men, while CCM resonates primarily with women. Okay, now before we get into this, he doesn't actually give any data to back this up.
Right.
Right? So it's anecdotal. And he admits that in the piece. There's data that young people are gravitating towards Orthodoxy. There's data that young people like CCM, but there's no actual data about genders gravitating.
There's data about men and worship attendance and worship, in particular Christian traditions, but not any data. I don't think he cites any data in the piece at all, but there does exist data about young Gen Z men in terms of church attendance versus women, or in terms of what kind of traditions or denominations versus women, but not worship style specifically, to my knowledge.
So here's the first question, though, that we got to tackle. Do we think this is real? Is this an actual, you think this is real? Like this is a legitimate phenomenon that's going on in Gen Z, that there is a divide between men and women over styles in worship?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I think, Kaitlyn, you are the only representative here. You're a millennial.
Yeah, I think she's...
I'm not. I'm a millennial by like a couple years.
But you're almost Gen Z.
I'm on the edge.
Okay, Drew and I are solidly Gen X.
But
So-
Skye, you know I'm so cool that I'm down with the kids.
You're both
Okay,
so
so,
cool.
so Kaitlyn,
Yeah.
why do you say definitively, yes, this is definitely happening?
The one thing I wish the piece had drawn out more is I don't think this is a difference primarily of worship preferences. I think the worship preferences are the byproduct of some other differences that we've talked about a little bit on the show. Some of the driver, it seems, by commentators of young men's increasing interest in the church is an interest in structure and doctrine and traditional family. And so that's going to lend itself towards more traditional forms of worship, because if you show up at a more traditional denomination, church tradition, that's more traditional forms of worship usually. Whereas some of the relative increase, there hasn't been a huge increase in Gen Z women, to my knowledge, religiosity, but there has been a good amount of spirituality, and it's actually stayed the same as opposed to going down like it has for prior generations. Most of their interest seems to be in looser spirituality, which CCM more easily is accommodated towards. It's easier to say, oh, I'm going to get really into my kind of megachurch CCM that like maybe isn't asking a ton of me in terms of doctrine. Maybe they aren't as forward with that part of the tradition. And maybe they're more open to diversity of theological opinions. And maybe it's easier for me to hop in to this megachurch where no one knows me and I can sing some CCM songs and hear a sermon and go home and then consult my horoscope or, go to a spirituality group or do some yoga. I can incorporate that into the diversity of religious traditions I'm pulling from. It's easier to do that with like a CCM megachurch, low church setting than it is to show up to your Roman Catholic or Orthodox or Episcopalian church and try and incorporate that into your other spiritual traditions. The draw there, I think, is the doctrine and the history and the tradition, and that seems to be drawing more young men as opposed to young men.
So what I hear you saying is that more young men like strict, clear, defined doctrine and boundaries.
Historical, rooted.
Right.
Yeah.
And younger women prefer looser boundaries, more integration.
Eclectic.
Okay, so he essentially makes the same argument in his piece, Luke Simon does. Let me read a couple of sentences that capture the core of what he's saying, which I think is similar to what you're saying, Kaitlyn. He says, first, the Gen Z worship divide is connected to how Zoomer men and women understand the faith itself. For many Gen Z men, traditional worship is less about nostalgia and more about non-negotiables. In their eyes, true faith doesn't bend with the culture. It plants its feet, folds its arms, and says, this is what we believe. It hasn't changed. It won't change. Take it or leave it. Then he talks about faithful Gen Z women tend to be more interested in personal authenticity and intimacy with God through personal devotion. It's not that they don't care about eternal theological truths, but they care greatly about an individual sense of honesty and vulnerability. CCM lyrics are emotive and expressive. In CCM, an authentic faith proclaims, this is me. No filters, no pretense. I'm here as I am before a God who loves me. And it's a little different than what you're arguing, Kaitlyn, but it's not terribly different.
Right. The difference that I would draw is just that some of that, and I appreciate what he's saying, and I really liked this piece and I wanted us to talk about it. Some of what he's saying, I think, lends itself a little too easily to some like gender stereotypes that have just like way already existed in the church. Like this is the conversation we've had for forever about like, oh, you show up at church and all the women want to talk about their feelings and all the men want to like pull out the theology books and get the doctrine right. And I think there's a reason that's a stereotype. There comes from, and a lot of that I think is culturally imposed more than anything else, but that does tend to fall on gender lines in many American evangelical churches. But I don't think that quite captures it. To be like the women are more interested in the emotion, the men are more interested in the doctrine. I think it's actually just more true that it makes sense that in a moment where there is a decline of kind of traditional family, there is a decline of the assumption that men should be in charge, that men are drawn to both doctrine that's really clear and a history, and often churches that have exclusively male leadership and have a real focus on the nuclear family. I'm not saying that's good or bad, but I'm saying it makes sense where if you're in a world where that used to feel more natural, it doesn't feel natural in any other space than these kinds of churches, that church might be a draw. Whereas if you're in a world where it's already telling you, especially on online spaces for Gen Z women, pull what works for you, like it's all about you kind of creating your smorgasbord of religious experience. You're going to be drawn to churches that cater to that in a different way. It's not just about emotion. Some of it's about doctrine. Like some of these women, I'm sure if they showed up at a church that fit all of their kind of worship preferences, but had really strict doctrine that they had to hold to, they'd be opposed to that, not because it's not intellectually appealing, but because they've already made an intellectual decision that says religion should work this way. I should get to pick and choose these practices. And I already have some really strong ideas about how the universe works or about what God is like. And you are actually in contradiction to the doctrine I already believe. It's not that I'm not interested in theology. It's that you're pretty rigid about it and it doesn't fit these other things I already believe. I'm more interested in like an eclectic religious experience. Okay.
Drew, I want to get your take on this, but I'm not sure I buy any of this. It feels a little bit to me like the argument is worship is from Venus and liturgy is from Mars. And it's just a gender stereotype thing. Until I see some data, maybe I'm going to be skeptical. But where are you on this, Drew? Do you think this is a legitimate phenomenon that we're observing?
Yeah, I'm certainly not an expert on this topic. My hunch is that, or just anecdotally, what I've seen is that a lot of young people, male and female, are drawn to at least the aesthetics of more liturgical worship styles. Now, when it comes to the actual content, I was a little surprised, and I was kind of wanting some more hard data. I remember a conversation I had with Ed Stetzer like years ago when we were at CT, and I was talking to him. I'm like, wow, all these young people are flocking to liturgical churches. And he's like, Drew, look where you are. You're in Wheaton, man. Like, don't extrapolate from this little weird microcosm. Anyway, so I worry that the trend, quote unquote, towards liturgical congregations might be smaller than he's making it out to be. Now, what I find interesting, I don't know the answer, but I have read about the kind of sharp bifurcation between men and women politically recently, younger men and women.
Yeah, there's a lot of data around that.
There's a lot of data on that. And is this mirrored here in some way? Young men being more conservative, young women being more liberal.
Yeah.
I also found it interesting when he talked about how young men are attracted to certain social media platforms that are very different than the ones that women are hanging out on. And I think he had a line in there about like the genders are divided by algorithm. And to me, that's scary, because then if that forms us and then it makes us come to church with totally different tastes and expectations, I guess it just underscores to me how important it is for the local embodied church of Jesus, to be a place where you can try to break down those silos that are created online and get people worshiping together, even if it's not their particular tastes or styles, which I understand is a hard proposition.
Yeah, I hear you. I think my hesitation with totally buying this argument is at least twofold. One is something you just mentioned, Drew, which is for a couple decades now, I have been seeing a steady flow of people raised in sort of low church evangelicalism being drawn towards more, not always super high church, but higher church traditions, whether it's just a slightly more formal Presbyterianism or a very formal Anglicanism or even Roman Catholicism. But it's not just the men. It's a lot of women too. And I think it's not about emotion versus reason or strict structure versus looser emotional structure. It's, I think, more about sacrament versus sermon. Like there's people who are tired of personality-driven church models that are all about the preacher, and they're looking for something more stable and eternal and less personality-driven. Why are you laughing?
I'm so sorry. It just sounds like you're being like, wow, so many people are doing exactly what I think they should do.
No, there's plenty of people who aren't doing this, but I'm saying I'm seeing people do this, and I'm not seeing it be mostly men. Like I'm seeing plenty of young women do this too. So I'm not. But here's the other reason. It wasn't totally clear to me in the article is this just a Gen Z phenomenon? Because if it's really about men and women and their stereotypical differences in the way they're wired, I think you would see this in other generations, not just Gen Z. And there is a decades-long tradition of baby boomers and Gen Xers being drawn towards very emotive megachurches, seeker-sensitive megachurches. And I've been in rooms, tens of thousands of men in khakis and loafers crying their eyes out at emotional music for Jesus. And I'm like, why was that so effective if men don't want that kind of worship? Why did it work for prior generations and it's not working for Gen Z if it's really a gendered-based difference and not just a generation-based difference?
I don't think his argument is that it's one or the other. I think it's both. There is a particular generation that has this kind of gender difference. Going back to what Drew said of the great political divide that is so much sharper among Gen Z than it is among other generations. And I think part of it is, and there's been other reporting about this that has backed up. Brian Burgess talked about this a lot, about it's not like there's this huge increase in religiosity among Gen Z, but it is really offsetting this constant decline that's been happening.
Yes. And
one of the reasons for that seems to be that you're not inheriting some of the baggage that your parents might have had because your parents didn't go to church. They were part of that decline of religious attendance or affiliation. And it's maybe the rebellious thing to do. I mean, and I think that this has, there's the gender difference, but the generational difference that you're talking about, Skye, is there was a time where, and it was not that long ago. I think we forget it was not that long ago. I mean, you all are old, so maybe you know how recent it was. But there was a time not that long ago when for men to have an opportunity to express emotion in a church environment was a reprieve from the standards placed upon them in the public square and the workplace. That has shifted, not only in that there's often kind of acclaim given to men who express emotion in ways that women do not receive in like the workplace or the public square, but also when those standards have shifted so much, when, you know, the future is female t-shirts are everywhere, when there's very different standards for what counts as caring about justice in the workplace when it comes to gender, it makes more sense that it would be a gender and a generational divide for Gen Z men in particular who haven't known a world where the workplace was rigid without emotion and the church gave this reprieve to express emotion. They might be going, I'm expected to act in ways that I don't want to act in the public square or in my workplace. And actually this church that's saying, no, you can conform to these kind of traditional standards of masculinity is suddenly very appealing. It's always been appealing for men in American churches, but could be especially appealing. Whereas for women, in an environment where secularism in their workplaces and public square is the kind of law of the land, there could be an appeal to spirituality and religiosity, but a real aversion to quote unquote returning to a more traditional way of thinking about religion or family or gender. And so I don't think there is a generational difference here and there is a gender difference here. And I think treating either of them as separate phenomenon doesn't do justice to the fact that Gen Z men and women are growing up in a different world than prior generations. And to Drew's point, they're living in different algorithms. So their response to the social changes that are happening will be very different. It seems like in this case, and this is other reporting that's happened, in both cases, they're hungry for something deeper and more, and often for something spiritual, but they're going to different forms of receiving it, it seems to me. I mean, I'm not just saying this from the article. I'm saying, like, when I look at students at Duke, it does seem much more often that the young men are drawn to the local conservative Presbyterian church. And it does seem very often that the women are drawn, not like you would think, to the more progressive Episcopalian church, but to a pretty low evangelical church that I think if they were to get into the nitty-gritty of the doctrinal statement at that church, they might really disagree with it. But they like the music. They like that they can show up and then leave and go do their other stuff. It fits their lifestyle and asks the right kinds of things of them that they're looking for, which is often community. And the men are often looking for structure and some kind of affirmation of traditional masculinity, and they find that in a different place.
I'm not saying you're incorrect. I just haven't observed it. And you're in Duke, I'm not. You're young, I'm old. So I am not the right person to engage in this.
I'm with you that I want to see some data on it.
Yeah.
But I appreciate the author of this article articulating this like impression, because I have gotten a similar one.
Well, and here's where I think I would resonate with what he's saying. If I think back to when I was a young person in the 90s.
Years and years and years ago.
Many years ago. But the past century, for goodness sake. When I was young, I had
1900s.
I had no exposure to high church traditions. I didn't know an Anglican church. I didn't know a high. And had I been exposed to that in those teen years or college years, I bet I would have really been drawn to it. Because since I was in high school, I have chafed on the emotion-driven worship experience, mega church, promise keeper kind of stuff. I've never really resonated with that. It's never been my temperament. And I'm not saying you should just worship in whatever temperament you prefer. There's a lot of good reasons to be part of a community other than just the music style or whatever. But I just wasn't exposed to that. It wasn't a popular stream of evangelicalism when in the 90s. It just wasn't there. Had I been, I think I would have definitely fallen into the same model that he's apparently seeing and you're saying that young men today are drawn towards. I don't know. Drew, what about you? Like, we're not that far apart in age. What were you exposed to?
I'm months younger than you, Skye. Don't try to pull me into your geezer
were you exposed to those options when you were in your late teens and early 20s?
And if I was, I would have just thought they were a different religion. I would have had no idea what to do with that. Right? Especially like Catholicism and that kind of thing. That wasn't. We were busy arguing about hymns versus choruses. And frankly, I wish we could get back there. I'm curious about what you guys think, though, about the author's proposed solution. And if I'm understanding it correctly, he kind of suggests a bit of an amalgam, like if we can deepen CCM and incorporate liturgical elements, which, by the way, in my experience, a lot of low churches are already doing. Yeah, I see that, right? Mm-hmm. Things they would have never been doing 10, especially 20 years ago. Reciting the Nicene Creed and doing the Lord's table every Sunday. And but is that having your cake and eating it too? Because I know in the worship wars of yesteryear, we had a solution, 2 services. One for people who like this, one for people who like that. So I don't know. Is he being too optimistic here, thinking that you can combine those into one church service?
I've seen churches that do combine emotive musical worship with structured liturgy. I've seen that done really, really well. I think what's harder is to do two separate completely services where one is high church liturgy and the other is low church music and choruses, because it strikes me as disingenuous to who you are as a community if you have two completely divergent ways of gathering. Does that make sense? Like that would strike me as very consumeristic and catering to an audience or different audiences rather than just embodying who we are as a church. So I think the consistency, maybe the thing that unifies both these sides of Gen Z, both genders, is they're looking for authenticity. So if you suddenly go, well, I'll give this to you and that to you, it's like, well, you're not, no one's going to buy it.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's a tension there, though, because we're also in the age of customization and I want everything tailored for me, my playlist, my this. But you're right. I think that there is that we place a high premium on authenticity as well. Do we act on it all the time? I don't know.
I also want to push back a little bit again on the I don't think the difference here is emotion. Like that's the part that feels like you said, Skye, like the liturgy is from Mars and CCM is from Venus or whatever. Because I think the most emotional I get in church services outside of babies is reading the Apostles' Creed together. I am deeply moved almost every week by that, or by receiving communion. And it's not because we do it in this hyper emotional way, So I don't think it's about emotion. I think it's about structure or lack of structure and rigidity versus how easily it can be incorporated into other spiritual traditions or other religious traditions. The other thing I would say is so much of this, I appreciate this article recognizing that there's deeper theological things at stake.
Right.
Because my issue with we have a first service and we have a second service, I've been in churches where the difference was quite literally just the songs. And I feel less bad about that. If it's really just that I don't like singing songs pre or post 2005, then what, I don't love that for the way that it creates essentially two distinct communities in the church. But I don't think there's a huge deal with making that a preference thing, the songs that you like. But it's when it's a very different service with a different structure that it's well, have we lost any sense that it's not just about the things we believe in our brains or the information we receive in a sermon that is given to us in this logical way? It's also about the theology we learn through the way we use our bodies and the rhythm and the songs and the structure of the service. That tells us something, to a point you make often, Skye. How the service is structured tells us something about what we think is most important. It tells us about who we are. Are we individuals that happen to be here together, or are we a community that was bound together by the death and resurrection of Christ? And so my concern with the solution, I think, Drew, is all churches from all different traditions should take opportunities regularly to examine, have we fallen into doing something for purely aesthetic purposes, or in this moment, for what we think will attract a certain subset or demographic of people? Or are we doing things because we think they're theologically important, because we actually think these hymns teach us good theology, or we think that this practice when it comes to the Eucharist is actually faithful to what Jesus asked us to do, or because we think this structure helps us confess the right things and confess our sins to each other? Those are the kinds of questions I wish we asked. And too often, both in the academy and in the church, the people who think about worship and the people who think about theology are in two separate camps. Yeah. There's the worship leader, there's the pastor, there's the theologian and the practitioner. And it's these are deeply theological decisions, and men and women need to be involved in making them together, because I think both ends of the spectrum he's describing have hit on something really important about what this moment needs, about how humans were meant to function, about how we should worship God. And if we do them in complete isolation, or we isolate the practitioners from the theologians, we'll end up in a mess.
I concur with that completely. It seems like there's two extremes. One extreme is a church that asks, what should we do to attract more people to our worship services? And then there's the other extreme, which is the church that says, what should we do to more faithfully form people as disciples of Jesus? Mm-hmm. And you need to know your context to know how to answer all those questions, whether it's the consumeristic attracting people to your church or the formative one of making disciples. Depends on your context. And it requires mature, faithful leaders with theological depth and biblical wisdom to figure that out for your community. And I think most of us come from a form of Christianity that heavily favored the first question. What do we do to attract a lot of people? And that leads to a very culturally defined kind of worship gathering. And that's what he seems to be saying some people, and in his observation, young men especially, are reacting against, is they want something stable and unchanging, even if it's completely foreign to our cultural context. And we'll see. I look forward to seeing more data on this. I think it's an interesting hypothesis that explains what's going on, but I'm intrigued, but not yet convinced. Let's put it that way. Okay, before we wrap up, just a quick announcement. The first chapter of my new book. What's my book called, Mike?
The World Born in You.
Skye.
The World Born in You. I'm struggling with a head cold. I don't know if you can hear it, but my brain is not fully functioning. The World Born in You, the first chapter, has been released this week for subscribers to Holy Post Plus at the $10 level or higher. If you are not a subscriber and you want to follow along as I write that book this year, get access to every chapter along with a bunch of other content and a monthly live stream where you can interact with me and other readers as I'm writing the next chapter, then you can go to holypost.com and sign up. Use the promo code BOOK and you'll get a 20% discount. And if you are currently a Holy Post Plus subscriber, but you're not at the $10 level, there's information at holypost.com about how you can also upgrade and get some benefit from that. And I don't know, you can go there and figure it out for yourselves. I think because we have a little bit of extra time before we all have to go, we might record a bonus segment. You guys want to do a bonus segment?
Sure.
I'm game.
Say yes, you do.
Yeah.
Of course, Skye. We want to do a bonus segment. We have our interview coming up in just a second, but if you stick around after the interview and you're a Holy Post Plus subscriber, you're going to get a bonus interview where Drew and Kaitlyn and I are going to talk about two different kinds of nationalism: aspirational nationalism and ancestral nationalism. David Brooks wrote a great article about this, and we're going to debate whether he's correct in the breakdown of these two kinds of nationalism and how it all relates to Christianity. So thank you guys for joining us this week. Go to holypost.com, check out all of our great content there, and stick around for the interview. We'll see you next week.
You know that I'm a skeptic. I like things to have evidence, proof, data. I like to research things before I commit to them. And that even goes for my supplements. I want to know that they're high quality. That's why for the last year, I've been drinking AG1. Unlike many supplement brands, AG1 conducts relentless testing to set the standard for purity and potency. I know I can trust what's in every scoop of AG1 because it's tested for 950 contaminants and banned substances, while the industry standard typically only tests for 10. AG1's ingredients are also heavily researched for efficacy and quality, and I love that every scoop also includes prebiotics, probiotics, and digestive enzymes for gut health. So, if you want to replace your multivitamins and your digestive aids, your immune support into just one simple scoop, start with AG1. Try AG1 and get a free 1-year supply of vitamin D3 and K2 and 5 free AG1 travel packs with your first subscription at drinkag1.com/holypost. That's drinkag1.com/holypost. Go check it out. And thanks to AG1 for sponsoring this episode.
This episode of The Holy Post is sponsored by our friends at World Relief, who have a special giving opportunity you should know about. If you've been listening to the show, you know the global displacement crisis is growing. Right now, more than 122 million people have been forced to flee their homes, more than ever before in recorded history. Even while you're listening to this episode, families are escaping war zones, political violence, and natural disasters, sometimes with only a few items they can carry. Parents are struggling to find food for their children and are wondering where their family will find shelter tonight. That's why World Relief invites you to join The Path, a community of monthly givers faithfully committed to creating safety, shelter, and belonging for families like these. Monthly giving provides consistent, life-changing support, things like emergency aid, food, water, shelter, job training, and long-term resettlement services. And during the month of June, your first monthly gift will be matched, dollar for dollar, up to $20,000. Don't wait. Visit worldrelief.org/holypost to start your monthly gift today. That's worldrelief.org/holypost.
So the odds are you feel a little more out of place in our culture than you did, say, 10 years ago, and maybe a lot more. And it's not just you. You are in very good company. But the question that we should be asking isn't whether you're an outsider anymore, it's what kind of outsider you are becoming. Our guest today is Patrick Miller. He's the co-author, along with Keith Simons, of Joyful Outsider: 6 Ways to Live Like Jesus in a Disorienting Culture. While it seems like everyone is debating how Christians should respond to the declining cultural influence of our faith in what Aaron Wrenn has dubbed negative world, Miller says this is a mistake, because believing that America was ever in a positive world for followers of Jesus is just to misread the whole situation. He argues that we've always been outsiders, and we should never completely conform to the culture around us. And while our outsider status should always be marked by joy, the way Christians engage this world as outsiders, he says, can look very different depending on your local setting, your gifts, and your calling. In this conversation between Kaitlyn Chess and Patrick Miller, he explains what that diversity of approaches looks like in his own church. Patrick Miller is a pastor of The Crossing in Missouri, and he co-hosts the Truth Over Tribe podcast. Here's his conversation with Kaitlyn Chess.
Patrick Miller, thank you so much for joining me.
It's fantastic to be with you, Kaitlyn.
Yeah, I'm so excited to talk about your most recent book, Joyful Outsiders. And before we get into some of the content of the book, the kind of different approaches that you give to Christians engaging with cultural and political questions I think are so helpful, let's just talk about the title and the kind of like approach to the book, Joyful Outsiders.
Yeah.
The thing that was intriguing to me about this, just like conceptually, like looking at the cover, reading the back of the book, was those 2 words are things that I tend to put in like different camps of Christianity. Like either there's the like joyful people who have a lot of hope for like what we can do in the world. Like it's really possible for us to do good work, to seek change in our communities, to leverage the gifts of the Christian tradition towards positive things in our communities, or we're outsiders. And either we're kind of disgruntled about that, or we are resigned to that. But we're either joyful or we're outsiders. We're not usually both. Yeah. How did you come to a place where you were like, this is the angle that I really think the church needs to hear right now?
Well, first of all, I'm glad you caught the juxtaposition, because that was totally intentional. When we were working on the book, originally it was called Beautiful Tension, which was also this strange juxtaposition of beauty, which we don't associate with feeling tension in our lives. We kind of want to pick one or the other. And I think that's the center of what the cross is. I mean, here's Jesus dying on a cross. It's beautiful, and yet he's dying. There's tension. There's joy. And I think about him being on the cross in Hebrews 12, saying that he took up the cross not out of duty, although it was a duty, not merely to save us from our sins, although certainly he rescued us and saved us and did a lot more than that on the cross. But it says that he did it for the joy that was set before him. And so that picture of Jesus on the cross, both painfully and joyfully dying for those that he loves, that I think has to be at the core of how we engage the world around us if we're going to follow him and become like him. But, I mean, I'll be honest, I think part of it is also just personal dispositions. I mean, authors can't help but reflect themselves into a book. And, I believe in having a kind of informed naivety in the world. Like, I don't want to be uninformed. I want to know that there's darkness and there's trouble and that people are in pain. And yet I want to have a kind of childlike naivety, that there is hope. I want to have a pragmatic idealism in the world. That we really can change the communities and the friendships and the relationships that we find ourselves in. And I want to be idealistic about it while also being pragmatic. And I want to have a kind of ironic sincerity in the world. Like, I know that there's some irony to being in a broken country, in a broken community, or even in broken relationships. And yet I think about 1 Timothy 1:5, and Paul says that the aim of our charge is a love that issues from a clean conscience, a pure heart, and a sincere faith. And I think when you take those 3 ideas together, I think it's talking about a joyful, sincere, pure, clean life where you're doing things out of sincere love for other people. And I don't know of another way to describe that than being a joyful outsider in the world.
That's so great. I think we are actually at a moment where people are kind of hungry for that level of sincerity. Like,
I agree.
The next book that I'm writing, the folder I have it saved under, it's not developed yet, or it's gonna take years to write, but like it's literally called the Happy Clappy Church book in my folder, because I'm just like, I think we need a little bit of like we need the criticism of the church. We need some serious reflection on hard things, and then sometimes I'm like, I'm looking for someone who's just like, I also think Jesus rose from the dead. And I'm just like, that changes everything. And I'm sincerely overjoyed by that.
I love
Patrick-
that. And I was going to tell you, I'm really looking forward to that book because I think there's something changing in our cultural mood right now. I think we're becoming postmodern. Some people are calling this metamodernism, and it's exactly what you're describing. There's an interest in sincerity. There's an interest in having a positive vision, knowing what you're for, not just knowing what you're against. And knowing what you're against has been key for the last 10 years. And so again, like I think there's this element of we have to figure out how to recontextualize the gospel in a culture that's beginning to hunger for a kind of positive, transcendent beauty that maybe it didn't hunger for a few years ago. I mean, I literally just published a piece over in Mere Orthodoxy about this, which is basically how to preach the gospel to people who are tired of irony, who are burnt out on cynicism. And I think, we're not all there, but I think there's a lot of people who are there. So anyways, I can't wait for that book. I'm excited for the Happy Clappy Church book.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Let's talk about the outsiders part of this. How would you describe the position that Christians are in, both kind of theologically, like what is the position we are in sort of universally, right? In all times and places, we occupy a certain position in relationship to the world. But then there's also the question of discerning, like what position do we occupy in this particular time and place? I think there's probably some people listening who hear a book about joyful outsiders, maybe a little skeptical of the joyful part. Maybe we've convinced them in the last few minutes, but maybe deeply skeptical of the outsiders part because they're looking at the American political system right now and they're thinking, I see a lot of people wielding Bible verses. I see a lot of people claiming to care about a Christian nation. I see a lot of people holding political power that at least claim to, if not in sincerity, hold a Christian faith and want to uphold Christian values. How would you describe what it means for Christians to be outsiders, either as a universal truth or as a truth here and now?
Yeah. Well, maybe it's good to start with the normative, which is how does the Bible talk about our identity? And when we think about terms of, what it means to be a follower of Jesus, we might talk about, I'm justified or I'm in union with Christ. Lots of these amazing statements about who we are in him. A theme that rarely gets discussed is that we are, in a sense, made into exiles because of him, because we are united to him. Again, this is in Hebrews 13. It talks about how Jesus was crucified outside the city gates. And it says, therefore, you shall go outside the city gates and bear the reproach that he bore. And so the author is saying, if you want to be crucified with Christ, you must become an outsider like Christ. And I think that normative pattern goes all the way back to the Old Testament. Abraham is a wanderer, a sojourner, and he's an outsider in his area and where he's living. And then you can go to the Jacob and his whole family living in Egypt. And of course, as they become slaves, they're outsiders. They have no political power. And then you move into the period of Israel actually having the land and living in the land. And you might say, okay, here we go. This is where Israel is no longer viewed as outsiders. But the truth is that the people are faithless. And so actually inside of the nation, you have the prophets and various figures who are remaining faithful to God. But as a result of their faithfulness, their refusal to commit idolatry, they become outsiders even inside of God's own country. And then, of course, you have the story of the exiles as they're taken from Jerusalem, brought into Babylon. And so the question for us in the modern moment becomes, as I'm looking at a Trump administration, for example, where we have a lot of people who are at least claiming or play acting to be Christians. And they're using Bible verses and they're using so-called Christian justifications to argue for positions that sometimes might not be Christian at all. You have to say, well, which era am I in? Am I in the era of I don't think we're Israel, so please don't hear what I'm not saying. But am I in the era of we have leadership that claims to follow and walk in the way of Yahweh, but does not? And if that's the case, I still am an outsider. I still am the person who has to say, I need to live my life differently than they're living it, even if people are going to be confused by that. Even if they're going to say, you two are in the same camp, you say, actually, no, we're not in the same camp. And that's going to change with time. The way, what I say in the book is that the question isn't, are you an outsider? It's how are you an outsider? The reality is we are all outsiders, but how we're outsiders, that's a liquid fact. It's going to change with your context. And sometimes I will say this, we get really fixated on the national context. And I think we miss the local context. And that's where this really lands, because depending on where you live, the manner in which you're an outsider changes tremendously. Look, I live in a college town. It's a very progressive city. And that means that the manner in which I feel like an outsider locally is very different than someone who's living in, a small rural town or a southern major city. Like these are major cultural differences. And so sometimes I think it's so fixated on what's happening in Washington that we miss how God's calling us to be an outsider locally, which is very contextual.
That's so helpful, Patrick. I agree so strongly, partially because I also live in a progressive, like, highly educated area where the things that make me an outsider here are very different than if I drive 2 hours in rural North Carolina. Very different, political reasons, theological reasons that I would be very different from the context I'm in. So the idea that we can, like, as talking heads on a podcast, be like, this is the position you are in, listener, wherever you are, is sort of ridiculous. But I so appreciate that in the book, you also identify not just, okay, we're going to have to discern the situation that we're in. There's these universal truths of how Scripture describes us. Then there's discerning the time and place that we're in. And then there's discerning how we respond to the conditions that we're under. Before we get to the kind of different approaches that you outline in the book, you also talk about just sort of different approaches or like different responses to being an outsider, being kind of combative towards that reality, withdrawing away because you're an outsider, avoiding the situation. Talk through the less or more faithful responses you have seen to people realizing, okay, I don't fit, whether it's in one way or another, I don't fit in the context that that God has placed me in, where I live.
Yeah, in the book, we look at various political groups that existed during the time of Jesus and ask, how is Jesus different than those groups? Who's doing something different than what they were doing? And I hesitate to say this in front of a scholar like yourself, so just live with anything incorrect I say here. But I think we did our work. I think we're
yes, the book is great. Yeah.
One way that you saw people engaging with the world was by being combative, and so you see movements like the Zealots who were trying to, via guerrilla warfare, overthrow Rome, or at least get Rome off of Israel's back. And we see that temptation very much so today with, what we might want to call the culture warriors, those who say the culture is against us. And so the only proper response is to take up arms. And that might be our Twitter account. That might be how we speak to our neighbor, and to fight at all costs to win political power so that we can effectively change the country in whatever manner we see fit. And Jesus, while he calls zealots to be his disciples, he disappoints them because he ultimately refuses to take up arms. When Peter pulls out the sword and cuts off the ear of the high priest, Jesus says, no more of this. I mean, he makes a very definitive statement. This is not how my kingdom works. This is not how we change the world. That's how the world changes the world, but this is not how we change the world. I'm going to show you how. I'm going to go die for the world. And so I think that's the response to combativeness. On the extreme other side, you see conformity. And again, you can find groups like the Herodians, those who served in Herod's court. Many of them were Jewish people who realized, look, if I play nice with Rome, you can even say this about the Sadducees, if I play nice with Rome, then Rome will play nice with me. I'll have political power, I'll have affluence, I'll have wealth. And as long as I don't speak up and resist, then I can fit in. And I think that conformity is a huge challenge for us, especially interpersonally, because sometimes being an outsider costs you relationships. It costs you promotions. It costs you opportunities. And conforming is a way to resolve the tension, to say, you know what, there's not going to be any tension. Combating also resolves the tension, by the way.
Yeah,
it resolves it by destroying the person you have the tension with, right?
Yeah.
They're both the same kind of strategy. Now, we talk about some other ideas like cloistering. These are people who maybe our temptation is just to go into our holy huddle and build a Christian subculture and not engage with the world. You have conflict avoidant people who sound kind of like the cloistering ones, but they live in the world. They just change the subject as much as possible to make sure that they don't get in an uncomfortable place. And you also have nostalgic outsiders, which I think are kind of like the Pharisees, but these are people who think that our glory days were in the past. They look back at the 1950s and say, look, there was a president, he was baptized into office. Most of the nation went to church every Sunday. We had prayer breakfast. Wasn't this an amazing time to live? Never mind the whole Jim Crow segregation South thing, but wasn't this an amazing time to live? And so they're just trying to go back into the past. They want to return to a golden age, just like the Pharisees wanted to return to, the time of King David and Israel's, power and hegemony over the land. That's what they want. And so I think we all have maybe each of these temptations in different contexts and different relationships. But I think each one Jesus rejects ultimately. And he rejects them, I think, ultimately because they're all ways of resolving tension.
I love that so much. It's such a good point that it's not that there's some people that are trying to resolve the tension. We're all finding different strategies for resolving the tension. The alternative is living in the tension. And I want to return to what you're just saying about this kind of nostalgia, because I see that happen all the time for different eras, right? I see people who are nostalgic for an imagined 1950s era where Christianity was the law of the land and everyone agreed with each other, and which, as you've pointed out, is a fantasy.
Yes.
But I also find people with a nostalgia for other eras of Christian history where it was like, well, we got it so right at this point, or we lived well together so perfectly at this point, and we forget like the early, we go back to the early church. We're like, oh, they were just living so perfectly together. And like, we forget that the New Testament is full of letters of all the things they were messing up. Or like, remember when the church was so unified, but in the Middle Ages, it's like, well, we were messing up all sorts of, I want to talk a little bit about the nostalgia, partially because part of what you do in the middle of the book is say, there's a lot of conversation, and we on the Holy Post have talked about this a bunch. This idea that Aaron Renn kind of coined the term of negative world. We used to live in a world that was more positive towards Christianity, or at least neutral towards Christianity, and now it is negative towards Christianity. And you give some examples in early chapters of the book, mostly like coming from the political left, of ways that Christians are confronted or even really challenged or harmed by people who are against Christianity. But it's hard because I feel like the conversation often happens with like one of two extreme positions. Either people say, yes, the country, the world has changed so much. Christians are persecuted. Things are so bad for us. Or the response to that then is like, no, nothing's changed. Everything's fine. You have a persecution fantasy. And actually, you are the ones in power. You're not the ones being persecuted. And I don't think either of those are like a really true evaluation or assessment of what's happening. Talk to us a little bit about how we might think about the fact that it seems like some things have changed, but it doesn't seem like we've gotten a good handle on what exactly has changed or how we should respond to it.
Yeah. I mean, let's start with nostalgia. I truly think the only way to be deeply nostalgic about the past is to know very little about the past.
Yes.
I don't say that to be offensive, but if there's a time or an era that you think, gosh, if we could go back to then everything would be good, I would encourage you to go read books about that time that unveiled the dark history. Years ago, I was speaking to Mike Higgins. He was the dean of students at my seminary, and we were very different. I'm white, he's black. He's older and had kids. I didn't have any kids at the time. He was in the military. I am I'm a pacifist, right? So like we could not be more different from each other in many ways. And I was complaining to him because I was doing college ministry about how hard it was, and everybody disagrees with Christianity and all these issues. And I said, wouldn't it be nice to go back into the past? And man, everybody would agree on sexual ethics, and things would be so much more simple. And he, in the kindest way possible, smiled at me and said, okay, really, if we went back to Mississippi in 1950 and we preached a biblical sermon on interracial marriage, do you think your life is easier? And we had such a good relationship. It was very convicting, very humbling to this young, proud man who thought he had figured things out. We just need to go back to the past. And I don't care what era you look back to, you can find things like that there, where people were compromised. And by the way, that means people will be able to do that with us. So let's have an accountability for ourselves. And so, I would just say that about nostalgia. In terms of the question of how things are changing, I think so much is contextual. You already pointed out, we have several stories at the beginning of the book that talk about how the left has made life hard for Christians. And some people have read that and gotten really offended. And I want to say, well, you need to come live in Columbia, Missouri, because my context is that I live in a very progressive college town. I didn't pick those stories because I'm picking against one side. I can tell you stories from the other side. And I know people who are living in Springfield, Missouri, and Branson, Missouri, just a few hours south of me, and they're going to have a flip-flop story. And so again, I want to say it's very contextual, how you feel like an outsider. And that's why I hesitate to, kind of give a one-size-fits-all solution. Like, this is what it always looks like in all contexts. My thing with Aaron Renn, and by the way, he used our church in his book. We were his opening illustration of, hey, this is how we're living in a negative world because of what happened in this church, right? Because again, we live in a progressive city, so we can be a great case study for how, some of that stuff happens. And I wrote a long piece rebuttaling him and saying, no, you've completely misunderstood our story. The problem with the negative world thesis isn't that he says that we live in a negative world. I think wherever you live, there is a negative world there. There is something there that is anti-Christian.
Yes.
And the degree to which you experience that persecution, look, you're not a Christian in China, you're not a Christian in Iran, so don't pretend like you're one of those two things. But can we not go to the other extreme of minimizing the pain that someone might experience as a result of being faithful to Jesus? And so that's all I would want to say is you live in a negative world. And that's the problem with Aaron Renn's thesis, is that he pretends there was ever anything but a negative world. The fact that he looks back in the past and says, this was the neutral world. I mean, really, Tim Keller living in New York City in the 1990s, where I think 3% of the population went to church regularly, that was the positive world. I mean, this is insane. It makes no sociological sense. And so that's my resistance. I just want to say we all live in a negative world, and we're not called to be against it. We're called to love it.
Yeah.
We're called to be joyful towards it. We're called to love it like a native, even as we live for a resurrected life in the future.
Yeah, I so appreciate that. And there's a part of the book where you're really kind of getting at both this sense of how Scripture describes our position, but also the kind of posture that we should have towards the world, like you were just describing. And what I love about it so much is there's been so much talk, especially recent election year. Everywhere I have gone to speak, the conversations I've had with pastors and Christian college students and campus ministries, there's a lot of talk about the prophets. And there's a lot of talk about kind of leveraging the rhetorical power of the prophets to condemn something. And to your point, depending on the context I'm in, it's either Christian nationalism or it's kind of progressive kind of fundamentalism in a different vein. And so either way, though, we're looking for Scripture to primarily do the work of condemning the world around us. And you can find colorful examples because there's a lot of condemning of like great sin and structural sin that pops up over generations, and that's all there. But I love that when you're really in the weeds of the prophets, you're also talking about that you can't separate that condemnation of the sin of the world from the hope for the redemption and restoration of the world. And I think most of us feel like the options before us right now are either sitting in the condemnation because we're serious Christians who really believe sin is real. Well, again, wherever you're finding the sin, we think it's really real and needs to be condemned. Or you're kind of, like I said before jokingly, happy, clappy, pious Christians, pie in the sky, waiting for Jesus to come back. But we can't hold those two things together. Talk to us a little bit about where you were just starting to go of how we can both have this sense of condemning what's really broken and wrong in the world, but not losing this sense of hope or not feeling like that hope is pious or kind of escapist from the world that we're in.
Yeah. So in the book, we talk about Jeremiah in particular, although you can find this in Isaiah, you can find it in Ezekiel and all of the major prophets. And so you'll find people who want to talk about the latter part of Jeremiah, where he's, condemning Babylon and he's telling the people, get ready to get out, grab your bags, Babylon's going to burn. It'd be best not to get caught in the conflagration. Mm-hmm. And they say, see, this is how we need to treat our modern day Babylon of America, whether that's the America of Christian nationalism or the America of AOC, you pick which one you want to be against. And we forget Jeremiah 29, which is his letter to the exiles, where he tells them to build houses and plant vineyards and to seek the flourishing of the city in which they find themselves. And by the way, we can flip-flop this. Some of us come from traditions where we're all about, seek the welfare of the city, but we forget the other half, which says, oh, but by the way, Babylon is full of idols, and the idols must be condemned, because where there is idolatry, there's not just sin, there's injustice and heartbreak and broken lives. And my point is we talked about tension. That's what we need. Like if you think about a rope for a second, if you want to have tension in a rope, you have to hold it taut. How do you keep it taut? Well, you can't put your hands close together because then it's going to be really loose, right? So you can't go halfway on on prophetic challenge and halfway on cultivation, right? That doesn't create tension. You can't go in just one direction, right? Because then it's still going to be loose. You need to push hard in both directions. We need to be both cultivators and challengers. And I love this because it makes you a paradoxical person. Like people won't know what to do with you because you are so serious about lovingly challenging what is destructive and sinful and broken in the world, and yet you are just as deeply serious about loving and helping and encouraging and making flourishing happening in your community. And those two things don't go together. I mean, this happens to us at a church. I mean, years ago, this is just a small example, but we were preaching through Genesis, and we got to the passage about God making male and female in his image, and the sermon did talk about some of the trans issues that were being discussed. And the sermon was basically, hey, this is what the Bible says about gender, but God calls us to love our trans neighbors. And we have lots of trans people in our church. And a lot of them said this was great. Like, I know we don't see eye to eye, but like you were loving and you were kind. But that was still a challenge to the world around us. Yeah. And as a result, we got kind of kicked out of a lot of art studios that we were involved with, a massive film festival that we had been partnered with for 10 years. It was really, really painful. I mean, these were close friendships of mine that I lost because of that sermon. In that same year, our church, we decided to work with a group called RIP Medical Debt to pay off medical debt of people in our community because it was crippling people. And we ended up we wanted to do it just for the city. We ended up raising far more money than we expected. And we ended up paying off, I think it was $43 million of medical debt in our state. And I remember meeting with someone who said to me after the trans sermon, they said, look, I wish you would be like that church that had paid off all that medical debt. And they just had no idea that we're the same place. And that's what I mean when I'm saying like, that's pushing hard in both directions.
Yeah.
And if we can become paradoxical like that, that tension creates creativity. It creates beauty. It creates surprise and delight and all the things that I think Christ should bring into the world wherever he's present.
That's such an incredible example. I've had that experience in my own church of, without getting into details, of people essentially saying a similar thing of like, wait, I didn't expect you to also do this, knowing that you believe that. Like, I didn't expect you to be a pretty traditional, conservative-ish, church, pretty orthodox theologically, and like really serve your homeless neighbors or like really care about to show up to advocate for the church you partner with that has some undocumented immigrants in it. Like, I don't put those things together in one box. And it's like, that can be painful when people expect things of you and then you don't fulfill them and they're upset. But also, like, that's the hope I have for churches, is that they are but you can't fit them in a partisan box. You can't fit them in how you expect different the camps you tend to put people in. That's really beautiful. A bulk of the book is about these like 6 ways of living faithfully as a joyful outsider that you describe. Talk about those different approaches. You don't need to like go through and explain all of them unless you really want to, but talk to us about both why you wanted to articulate different approaches and maybe give us some examples of what those are.
Yeah, I'll save going through all 6. It gets really boring if I'm trying to do
read the book.
If you go to joyfuloutsiders.com, you can actually take a little test that will help you identify which of these 6 ways you might be most closely identified with. But here was our main thing. I already said I don't like one-size-fits-all solutions. I don't like one-size-fits-all clothes because that means one-size-fits none. That's what they should be called. And I think when we look at how the Bible and how Jesus designed the church, Paul says that we're a body with different parts. And while that's talking about spiritual gifts, I think the same thing applies when we're talking about how we engage with the world around us. And the reason I say that is because looking at both the Old and New Testament, the profound diversity of ways in which God's faithful people engage the world around them is unavoidable. In fact, the best way to avoid it and what you'll find is that churches will pick one example. They'll say, we're a Daniel church. We're an Ezra church, right? We're a whatever you like. We're an Elijah church, They pick one way of engaging the world and they say, this is going to be our angle. And God didn't give us one way. I think about it like music. I mean, you can have a beautiful song with a single voice, but when you start adding multiple voices, harmony and layers, that's the most beautiful music you can imagine. And God wants us to sing that song. Jesus is far too complex to be captured in one single way of engaging the world, So we have things that seem like total opposites. Some people are called to be prophets, to be protesters, people who are engaging with the world as protesting injustice, changing the world by challenging injustice. And we also have people we think are builders, people who change the world by building institutions. And those two people could see like polar opposites from one another. There's a real beauty when those same people exist in the exact same church community. And that's what we want to see, is just a diversity of people engaging the world in diverse ways, and also to challenge people, because the reality is you might have one way you particularly engage the world, but there might be a circumstance in your life where you have to take on a different way. If you're in the room where injustice is happening, you don't get to say, I'm not a protester, so I say nothing. Oh, God might be calling you to become a protester. So won't you be glad that you have a framework for this is how, in this scenario, I can engage my community, my world, my workplace, or wherever it is you find yourself.
Yeah, I found that so helpful. I did take the test. I told you earlier, unsurprisingly, someone who went to seminary. What's the term for the first one? The spiritual formation, the trainer. I mean, while I was going through it, I was like, oh, dang it. I'm one of those people. I've worked in the church, but it was so helpful. Partially, I mean, when I was going through the test, I was trying to be really honest about like some of these statements are things I know I should do, or I know I should care about. And I was trying to be really honest about like, I don't in my day-to-day life. And it was really helpful to think it's not a bad thing that some of these things are not where I most naturally go or where I feel most naturally gifted. For example, I'm looking at some of the more like institutional building or making connections like at higher levels of power. And I'm like, I want to talk about Bible studies and spiritual practices. And it was helpful to go, I think I need to be in relationship with those people who are gifted and called to do those things. And I think they need to be in relationship with me. And isn't that the beauty of the church? So like I spend all this time with people who are so different from me. I also then was thinking about my own church and churches I've been in and institutions I've been in and families I've been in, and thinking in some of those spaces, it feels like we do overvalue one approach over another. Do you think that's true with American evangelicalism? Do you think that's true in many of our churches? Or have you seen that where there's one approach or another that sort of is held up as the faithful approach and others get kind of, put to the wayside?
Yeah. I definitely see that. If you're looking at more pietistic traditions, for example, you're going to see a lot of trainers, people who say, look, we can kind of ignore the problems that are happening in the world around us. We just need to focus on praying, reading our Bible, and being in Bible studies. And that's what's going to change us. And then we'll change, by having changed people, we'll change the world. You see other traditions, or like a lot of parachurch ministries, like Young Life would be an example, or Crew. I mean, these are great ministries. They had a big influence on my life. So I'm not demeaning them, but they tend to all be what we call ambassadors, right? The way you change the world is through evangelism, right? We don't need to talk about politics. We don't need to talk about these big cultural issues. We just got to focus on converting the human heart, right?
Yeah.
And you can see that all these they're true statements as long as they're not true exclusively. And so again, you just kind of got to know yourself and where you come from. Like if you're in the Reformed tradition, you have a lot of advisors. These are the people who say you change the world by kind of getting into places of influence and then kind of from the top down shaping things. So you're going to see a lot of this. There's probably one of them is the artist. So there's probably some artistic churches out there where, the only way to change the world is by being really artistic, but we don't really want to talk about truth, so let's watch out for those prophets. We don't really want to talk about institutions, so let's watch out for those builders. And so you can see this in different places. But when you see all in one place or many in one place where they're all being valued, that's a beautiful church. And I do think those churches exist.
Yeah, that's so helpful. And I think it's helpful for people to look around at the context they're in and go, where do I see where we tend to overemphasize? Or like, what does it seem to be kind of the vibe here that maybe there might be people's gifts that we're missing because we're so focused on this one way? Patrick, one last question. I imagine there are people listening who are going, okay, this is really great all in the abstract. And I love the idea of like figuring out what my approach is and trying to do it faithfully. What would your encouragement be to people who are like, I'm in the middle of a really tricky scenario. I'm in the middle of something where it seems like, to your point about tension, like there's just no good option here, right? Like my church is going through right now a really tricky thing with sexuality because our denomination is starting to believe things different from what our local church does. And our congregation itself is super divided on those questions and we're trying to work it out. Or I know people who are trying to advocate really well for the public school their kids go to, and they really want to be involved, but there's sort of standards given to them for how they can be involved that are in conflict with their conscience. Or I know people who are in really conservative environments and they're like, I get emails about this all the time where people are like, I'm a Christian and I want to be a Christian in public life. But in the context I'm in, that's associated with really conservative politics. So I don't know if I should offer a public prayer at a political meeting because it'll get kind of put in the like Christian nationalist camp. But I also believe prayer is really good. So you can't speak to any of those specific scenarios, but like, what would your just kind of like process encouragement be to someone who's like, what I really want is someone to just tell me what to do. I know you can't do that, but how might I, in the particulars of my situation, discern how I should respond?
Yeah, I mean, I hate to say something that's going to sound trite, but remember, I already said I like a certain
Sincerity.
level of informed naivety. So I'm going to be a little bit naive here. So on the one hand, let's just state the obvious. What people are going to say, like read the Bible, and because sometimes the Bible does give you pretty clear ethical standards for the thing that you're trying to resolve. Talk to people who have wisdom. In other words, they have lives you look at and you say, hey, you're walking with godliness, you're walking with Jesus, you have healthy relationships. Even if you don't know a lot about the topic I'm dealing with, you still might have wisdom for what I'm facing. But the last thing I would say is this, and this is maybe the more counterintuitive thing. I would just encourage you to receive this as a gift. I think that when we're in tension is precisely the moment that we are most with Jesus. There's a tightrope walker. His name was Charles Blondin, and he built a tightrope across the Niagara Falls. And so this is the 1800s. People come out, and they're all there to watch him die. I mean, if you read the newspaper articles, it's hilarious. Everybody's like, yeah, this guy's going to get smashed to atoms. That's what they're all there for. And he starts walking across this tightrope, and he gets halfway across, and everybody thinks he's done because he sits down, but he pulls something up on a rope from a boat below him, and it turns out it's a bottle of wine. He drinks the entire bottle, and then he finishes the tightrope, which seems incredibly unwise. And so for the next 2 weeks, he keeps doing this, except, he does it backwards. He does it blindfolded. He does it without one of those, tight wire bars. He does it with a camera, like old timey camera, and takes a picture of the crowd. And so they begin to think he can do anything. And finally he asks him, do you think I can do anything? And they all start cheering, yes, yes, yes. And then he says, okay, then one of you volunteer to get on my back and I'll carry you across. And so you know what's going to happen. No one raises their hand except for one man, a guy named Harry Calcord. He raises his hand and he clambers up onto Charles Blondin's back, and they start going across. And as they're going across the wire, the guy wires start to snap, and it's blowing wildly in both directions. It wasn't designed for that much weight. And according to Calcord, Blondin says to him, Harry, you are no longer Harry Calcord. You are Charles Blondin. When I sway, you sway. When I move, you move. Don't try to balance yourself. Move with me and I'll move with you, or else we perish. And they make it to the other side. And when I think about what it looks like to be in tension, it's like Jesus saying, hey, you've seen me go across the tightrope, right? I died and I rose again. I conquered death. And now I want to invite you to get on my back. But the only people who raise their hands are those who are willing to go on that knife's edge, are those who are willing to enter into those places of terrifying tension where you really feel like you could fall and die. But here's the beauty. If you raise your hand, if you're on his back, if you're one with him, you are the one who hears, when I sway, you sway. You are no longer who you are. You are me. We are one. When I move, you move. And my life's greatest aspiration is to be one with him. And to enjoy him in all things. And so the tension is painful. I'm not minimizing the pain. You're going through a cross. You're going through a crucifixion. But if you can do it with Jesus, if you can bring him into it, if you can start to trust him and trust the outcomes that might be really scary, but you know what? God can carry me through this. That doesn't answer the question of what to do, but it does tell you how to go through it. And I will tell you what, at least for me, it frees me from the pride, the selfishness, the fears that often lead me to make the kinds of decisions I would have never made if I was simply allowing my heart to rest in the one whom I love.
Oh, Patrick, thank you so much. Thank you for your work and Keith's work on this book. And thank you for your time today. This was really beautiful.
Thanks for the time. This has been great. It's great to be with you.
The Holy Post Podcast is a production of Holy Post Media, produced by Mike Strelo, editing by Seth Gorvet. Help us create more thoughtful Christian media by subscribing to Holy Post Plus at holypost.com/plus. Also, be sure to leave a review on Apple Podcasts so more people can discover thoughtful Christian commentary, plus ukulele and occasional butt news. Visit holypost.com for show notes, news stories, Holy Post merchandise, and much, much more.